Euron Greyjoy stood upon the prow of the Silence with his good eye half-lidded, breathing in the brine of the sea as he considered the sharp glimmer of King's Landing in the distance. Red spires and tall towers crowned the horizon, and a roll of gray clouds gathered overhead as though the heavens themselves awaited his next move. Lightning skittered through the clouds, ominous and cold. He smiled to himself, a thin, dangerous curvature of the lips, a shred of delight amid a sea of cruelty. He had dreamed of this moment for months. Even as he made his way from the Iron Islands back into the deadly game of Westeros, he had never wavered in his conviction. The Iron Throne would soon be his. Nightfall turned the waters into ink and the lights of King's Landing into flickers of molten gold. Euron allowed his men a moment's rest, though his own mind whirled like a tempest. Ever since the final collapse of certain threats to the crown, dragons, dead men, Targaryen ambitions, he had watched Queen Cersei Lannister cling precariously to power. She was cunning, but she was beset by enemies on every side. And what better time for him to strike than now? He remembered the first time he had laid eyes on that monstrous throne of swords. It was a relic hammered from hundreds of blades of Aegon's foes. He had strode into the throne room with a swagger, seeing the coiled metal, the 1,000 points of death. Something in him had stirred, a black, enthralling desire to seize it and rule by fear. Iron suits me, he had thought then. After all, was he not of the Iron Islands? Had he not carved out a legend that matched the cruelty of the drowned gods themselves? On the Silence, his crew was the only family he kept close, though Euron had always found intimacy distasteful. They were men who had tasted the salt of his madness, men who had sworn their lives to him not out of loyalty but out of sheer terror or greed. Most had been tongue-cut. They were men who could neither question his command nor speak a whisper of his plans. Their silence was his fortress. He let them rest now because soon, in the darkness, he would require them to row, to scale walls, to slit throats. War was a language Euron knew well, but subterfuge was an art. He wanted to make a masterpiece of King's Landing's downfall. He turned away from the prow and strode along the deck, gloved hands brushing the wet wood. The swells beneath the ship's keel sent murmurs through the silence. In a war camp or the Red Keep, walls and stones softened the movement of the earth. But here at sea, the currents rocked everything in an endless churn. Euron felt it deep in his bones and took it in as a silent promise. The sea had always sustained House Greyjoy in times of famine or triumph, but it had never come to King's Landing with a king's ambition. Tonight it would. Yet he did not plan to bombard the city from the sea. No. He had something far more devious in mind, for Euron knew the shape of the Golden Company's swords, the loyalty of the city's gate captains, and the thirst for coin that drove certain sellswords in Cersei's employ. Over the many moons of false fealty, he had inserted 1,000 small cracks in Cersei's armor, and now he intended to shatter her defenses in a single strike. He traced a black-leathered finger across his patch, as if acknowledging some spirit beyond sight. Let the Red Woman call upon her flames. Let the Lannister Queen rely on her wildfire. He had his own sorcery, one of cunning, of secrets purchased with blood and silver. He would tear the very heart of the capital from within. Hours later, after he had issued his silent commands, the Silence drifted further up the coast in stealth. Euron embarked on a smaller boat with a handful of trusted men. They rowed through a hidden cove, slipping through an ancient smuggler's route that Davos Seaworth might have once used. He went ashore upon a small stone beach rarely patrolled by gold cloaks. There, they made contact with an ally who had no more love for Cersei than Euron did. A bitter Tyrell cousin, whose name had never been worth remembering. The man's face was gaunt from sleeplessness and malnourishment, but in his eyes burned a relentless desire for revenge against the Queen who had orchestrated the explosion of the September of Baelor and the annihilation of the Tyrell line. The Tyrell cousin led Euron and his men through a labyrinth of half-flooded catacombs beneath the city. No rats scurried near them as they pressed forward, for the slightest echo of Euron's presence seemed to drive living things away. Darkness enveloped them, and foul water rose up to their knees in some passages, but Euron's boots pressed onward. The flicker of torches revealed half-collapsed stone walls, rotting beams, once grand tunnels whose identity had been lost through centuries of war. Beneath King's Landing, an underworld thrummed, unspoken, waiting for those with enough daring to exploit it. When they reached a chamber where broken crates and scattered bones littered the floor, the Tyrell cousin leaned forward. Cersei's men rarely come down here. He guided Euron's group toward a narrow corridor. Up ahead is an old exit route that leads near the Red Keep. Soldiers used it in the days of the Targaryens, though it was mostly sealed off. Euron listened, silent, letting the hush of the underground lull him. He could hear the distant drip of water and the methodical tread of his men behind. The Tyrell continued in a rasp. They say the Mad King once used these catacombs to store casks of wildfire. If that's true, I've never seen any proof. Euron's eye gleamed in the torchlight. He had heard the stories. Cersei had used wildfire on the September, but perhaps there were still hidden barrels, relics of a Mad King's obsession. He would not rely on rumor, though. He had his own ways of ensuring a vantage. As they waded deeper, he felt an almost supernatural sense of purpose tighten around him. Something older than the Targaryens lurked in these tunnels, a memory of dragons. He let the specter of it guide him, wanting to entwine his own shadow with the city's nightmares. Soon, they emerged into a cramped courtyard behind a defunct stable. The night air was stifling, smelling of sewage and horse sweat. A low moon cast a pale silver glow. The Tyrell cousin pointed to a battered door set in the crumbling wall of the city's underbelly. The group advanced, quickly dispatching a single city watchman who had no chance to raise an alarm. The cousin rummaged under a loose stone, pulled out a ring of keys, and unlocked the door. It scraped open, revealing a winding staircase that led up into the bowels of the Red Keep itself, near the dungeons, if Euron's memory served. Euron turned to the cousin, found him trembling with hatred for Cersei, or perhaps fear at the monstrous plan Euron had confided in him. Euron placed a gloved hand on the man's shoulder. "Your hatred will be fed," Euron said softly. "When I tear her from her seat of power." They ascended in silence, their footsteps echoing. At one point, Euron reached out to press a hand against a smooth stone wall. Through it, faint voices reverberated. A change of guard, perhaps. He motioned for stillness. When the voices receded, they continued upward until at last they reached a rusted iron gate. The Tyrell unlocked it, and they stepped into a passage within the Red Keep sprawl. Euron exhaled quietly, a grin curving his lips. He was inside. Here, in these halls of cunning and murder, Cersei believed herself supreme. But Euron had spent countless nights laying the final bricks of her undoing. Her illusions would be torn away. He parted from the Tyrell cousin near an antechamber. The man would slip away to spread confusion among the low-ranking Lannister guards he had managed to buy off. Some were desperate for coin. Others simply despised serving a queen who seemed ever on the brink of madness. A bribe here, a blackmail there, and the threads were ready to be pulled. It was Euron's talent to exploit men's darkest corners. Their greed, their terror, their ambition. When Euron reached the corridor that branched toward the dungeons, he paused. On the walls, torches and iron sconces cast wavering light over the stained stones. The musty smell reminded him of Pike, of dark corridors that had rung with his footsteps in younger days, before he drowned his conscience in wanton cruelty. He followed the hallway toward a smaller courtyard, stepping past a guard station. Two men in Lannister crimson dozed lightly, their halberds leaning against the wall. Euron's men, silent as wraiths, approached. One guard died with a dagger in his throat before he could even start awake. The other had time to open his eyes, see the blur of a black cloak, and then it was over. The hush of the courtyard pressed in again. Euron scanned the yard. Overhead, a single rectangular window glowed with faint candlelight. His sources told him that beyond that window was a private study Cersei frequented for clandestine meetings with Qyburn. If he wanted her undone, he needed to sow conflict from the highest vantage. But not yet. He had a bigger plan for the night, one piece in a tapestry of betrayal. He withdrew, motioning for his men to carry on. There would be another guard post, and they would handle it the same way. His shipmates were swift, knives glinting in the gloom. Quiet kills. Already, a few skillful saboteurs would be working their way into the city's watchtowers, ensuring the beacons would remain unlit. Others among his silent crew infiltrated the gates, bribing or threatening the men stationed there into submission. Soon the gates of King's Landing would stand wide for the legion of sellswords Euron had paid to wait just beyond the horizon. By dawn, the city would be his, if all went as planned. A crow cawed somewhere in the darkness. A bleak, echoing note. Euron recognized it as one of his men's signals. He nodded to himself. So it begins. He made his way to a secluded gallery lined with ancient tapestries. There he found a man wearing a black cloak of the Night's Watch. But the Night's Watch had no place here. This was no crow loyal to Castle Black. This was one of Euron's personal spies, an assassin who wore black feathers to stoke confusion. The man nodded, murmuring, "All is prepared. She's returned to her chambers." "Cersei." Euron's voice was low, draped in menace. The man shook his head. "Her protégé, the one she uses for certain dealings. That would be Qyburn or some other conspirator. It didn't matter. Euron had plans for them all. She is in the royal apartments," the spy continued. "The queen is in the throne room with the Lord Commander. They're discussing urgent matters of the Golden Company. How many men does she keep near her at this hour? 24 in the throne room, perhaps. Some loyal, some half-bribed, not all certain. But she's never parted from the mountain either." The spy's face twitched at the mention of the hulking monstrosity that was Ser Gregor Clegane. "He's a fearsome foe." Euron gave a cold smile. "I know what that beast can do. He'll be complicated. But every dog has a muzzle." He set a hand on the hilt of his sword, feeling the battered crossguard under his thumb. "Remain close. If you see an opening to slit Qyburn's throat, do so. If you fail, you die." "Agreed." The assassin gave a curt, solemn nod. He drifted away, vanishing into the hush of the corridor. Euron admired men who needed few words to kill. One step at a time, Euron told himself. He had the city gates ready to be seized. He had sabotage afoot in the watchtowers. Certain lords and ladies in the capital, resentful of Cersei's iron grip, had been fed a promise of new leadership and new coin, and they waited only for word that the queen's power was broken. As the city's confidence crumbled, Euron would bring in his paid armies by the thousands. He had spent a fortune plundered from the high seas, from the ruins of once rich estates, from the coffers of lesser lords who had fallen beneath his lash. The Golden Company, ironically once pledged to Cersei, was teetering in its loyalty. Euron Silver had found them too piece by piece. He had whispered to their officers of a new king who would reward them beyond measure. In the tapestried gallery, Euron paused to watch shadows shift upon the walls. Lightning flashed somewhere outside, casting a stuttering glow that outlined a figure emerging from the far corridor. Euron slid into a deeper shadow, hand on his sword. He saw it was a Lannister guard, a woman with a tired expression. She walked with slow determination, as if patrolling the halls out of weary habit more than devotion. Euron stepped forth, silent as a cat, pressing a dagger against her side before she realized he was there. He whispered in her ear, "You value your life?" She froze, a breath caught in her throat. A flicker of recognition crossed her features as she saw the glint of Euron's leather, the patch over his eye, the faint sigil of the kraken on his belt. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged. "There are two ways this goes," Euron purred. "Tell me how many stand guard in the throne room with the queen, and you walk away. Scream, and I spill your entrails across this lovely carpet." He pressed the dagger to emphasize the point. She gulped. "20 men, maybe 25. Half are new recruits, a few from the original City Watch. Changes nightly. Since the war ended, the city's short on well-trained men. We're stretched thin." Euron's grin cut through the darkness. "Good. Now I will hold you to your word. You're to walk back to your post and say nothing, or I'll have your tongue. Then I'll have your family, and your village, or your father's orchard. Whatever your life once was, I'll burn it and salt the ground. Do you understand?" She nodded jerkily, fear blossoming in her wide eyes. Euron withdrew the dagger and motioned for her to leave. She hurried away, stiff with terror, risking only the briefest glance back at the man who stepped from the gloom like a demon. Euron listened to her footsteps recede. The city was rife with weak hearts easily cowed. Cersei might have once inspired terror, but Euron was the living embodiment of it. It was a delicious thought. He would take her seat and devour what remained of her empire. At length, Euron heard another faint crow call from outside the gallery. That signified that certain gates had fallen to his men. The hour was near. He made for the throne room. He remembered every turning of the Red Keep's labyrinth from the days he had feigned loyalty to the Queen. She had wanted an alliance with the Iron Fleet, and Euron had proven himself a savage dog at sea to earn her trust. But behind that vicious grin, he had always held a deeper ambition: to eventually betray her and make himself king of the Seven Kingdoms. Perhaps the notion was madness, but madness had never frightened him. It was weakness that he abhorred. His boots whispered on polished stone as he approached the grand corridor leading to the throne room's colossal doors. Flickers of torchlight danced across tall pillars. The hush felt unnatural, as though the palace itself trembled at the possibility of betrayal. Here and there, Euron glimpsed small groups of Lannister guards murmuring to one another. Some looked uneasy, occasionally glancing over their shoulders. Something was in the air, fear or suspicion. Euron stalked them from a distance, hidden behind pillars, searching for the best entry point. If he could stir chaos at the right moment, half of them might turn on one another, unsure of who was friend or foe. As the last midnight hour approached, thunder rumbled. A warm wind swept in from the windows, carrying the tang of the sea. The men near the throne room parted to make way for a pair of armor-clad knights of the Kingsguard, still referred to as such, though they served a queen. One of them was tall, slender, vigilant. The other was broad-shouldered, with a battered sigil. Euron recognized them from the nights he had feasted with Cersei, when she paraded her guard about. He had no illusions these two would fold easily. They had sworn their swords to her, and some men still believed in loyalty. He would kill them if they did not yield. A savage glee smoldered in his chest. After all, dethroning a queen must be done in blood. A shriek rippled down the corridor. Euron hissed under his breath. Had one of his men moved too soon? Or had a guard discovered a body and raised the alarm? In the flickering torchlight, the Lannister guards exchanged alarmed words, forming up in defensive positions. Euron bared his teeth in a grin. So be it. If the city would soon be his, let the first taste of dread begin now. The tall double doors of the throne room were wrenched open by a startled pair of doorkeepers. A swirl of torchlight and shadow revealed the high vaulted space within, the iron throne looming at the far end like a malignant spider. Cersei Lannister stood at the foot of the throne steps, still robed in a regal black gown that shimmered with gold filigree. Her golden hair was cropped short, but her eyes blazed with the cold certainty of a woman who had held power and refused to relinquish it. She was flanked by the monstrous silhouette of Ser Gregor Clegane, helmeted and silent, and by a handful of Queensguard in pristine white cloaks. Euron saw her face contort with fury as men rushed in, babbling of assassins in the corridors of sabotage. She lifted a hand, commanding silence. Through the parted doors, Euron watched her scan the antechamber, taking stock of which men were loyal, which might waver. She still believed herself unassailable, he thought, though fear flickered behind her eyes. A moment later, a faint tremor rattled the windows. Somewhere across the city, an explosion or a heavy crash shook King's Landing. Euron inhaled sharply. That was likely the signal from his men to the unsuspecting Golden Company near the city walls. The final stage had begun, a carefully orchestrated strike. He moved into the open, stepping into the corridor where the guards could see him. Some recognized him at once and froze in confusion. Had the Iron Fleet's admiral not been an ally? Euron spread his arms as if in greeting. "My queen!" he called, voice echoing under the vaulted ceiling. Apologies for the disturbance, but I bring urgent news of the city's gates. They're opening." And then he laughed, the sound harsh and mocking. "They're opening to my men." Cersei's eyes narrowed. A tremor of rage darkened her face. "Treason." She spat the word. Ser Gregor rumbled a low breath, like an ox on the verge of a charge. Euron walked forward, stepping over the threshold into the throne room. The Lannister guards parted, uncertain whether to attack him or heed their queen's wishes. Thunder grumbled outside, as if the night itself conspired with him. "Treason," he repeated, tasting the word. "Oh yes, you might call it that. I prefer to name it destiny." Cersei did not retreat. She never had the look of a cornered animal, even now. She was more like a lioness whose territory had been threatened. "What have you done?" Euron offered a slight bow. "I've liberated the throne from your incompetent clutch, dear queen. It's nothing personal. Merely that you are ill-suited to hold power. You've alienated every great house. You've lost any real alliances. The Golden Company will soon discover a new paymaster in me, and the Iron Fleet has turned its sails against you. King's Landing has grown tired of you, Cersei Lannister. The hour has come for a new hand upon the sword." She raised her chin. "You think you can waltz in here, kill a few men, and proclaim yourself king? You'll need more than tea. The throne requires more than cunning, it requires fear. And every corner of Westeros fears me." Euron chuckled. "True, but they've not yet learned what it means to fear Euron Greyjoy." He nodded toward the corridor, where the clamor of steel and shouting grew louder. "But they will." A guard rushed forward, sword raised to strike Euron. Faster than a hawk, Euron parried with a clang, twisted, and slashed the man's belly open. Blood sprayed and the guard toppled, groaning. Another guard lunged, but Euron's silent men, newly arrived behind him, seized the corridor. Steel clashed, curses rang out. Euron advanced step by step, forcing his way deeper into the throne room as chaos mounted behind him. He could see in the corners of his vision that some of the Lannister men turned on each other, confusion rampant. Those who had accepted bribes or were threatened by Euron's blackmail attacked their fellows, or simply fled. A handful remained loyal to the queen, but their lines fragmented under the sudden onslaught. Ser Gregor moved forward, unstoppable, sword raised. Euron tensed. He had faced monstrous men before, but the mountain was a beast from the darkest nightmares. Yet Euron's grin never faltered. He drew his sword, no ostentatious Valyrian steel, but a well-crafted blade all the same, and prepared to meet the juggernaut. Cersei's eyes flicked with satisfaction, as though she expected her champion to crush this upstart in mere moments. Euron's grin widened. They closed the distance. Gregor swung with inhuman might, a blow that whistled through the air. Euron ducked, the sword's edge missing his head by an inch. His own riposte rattled against the mountain's plated armor, hardly leaving a scratch. The behemoth advanced with a second, punishing slash. Euron shifted sideways, letting the blow cleave empty air, then hammered the pommel of his sword into Gregor's side. It was like striking a stone tower. His men tried to circle the knight, but Gregor roared, backhanding one of them with enough force to shatter bones. The man flew across the room and struck the marble floor with a sickening thud. Euron realized trying to kill Gregor in single combat was a fool's errand. He backed away, luring the monster away from Cersei, giving one of his hidden assassins a clearer line of approach. Another of Euron's men rushed in from behind, slashing at a gap in the mountain's armor near the back of his knee. The blow was ill-timed. Gregor spun around and slammed the tip of his sword through the attacker's chest. A savage twist of the wrist flung the body aside. Blood spattered across the polished floor. Euron advanced again, using that moment to hack at Gregor's left arm with all his might. Sparks flew. The black plate dented, but still the mountain loomed. Cersei watched from near the throne steps, her face pale, though unwavering. It might have been fear or fury or both. She scanned the throne room, seeing her men falling back. "Hurried off." Euron smirked. Yes, they would rush to prove themselves useful, scurrying like mice from a burning barn. All he needed to do was occasionally crack the whip, order an execution or two, and their fear would keep them in line. Meanwhile, the common folk would quickly realize that the new king's men walked the streets with steel in hand, ready to punish any sign of unrest. Euron would quell them as thoroughly as the Lannisters had, perhaps more so. In time, he might consider playing at mercy for the illusions of stability. But at heart, Euron Greyjoy thrived on chaos. He beckoned a tall, scarred, ironborn officer who had served with him for many years. "Bring me word of Cersei's condition. I'll want her properly secured. No chance of escape." The man nodded and left. Euron leaned back, feeling the prick of a blade in the throne graze his shoulder. He didn't mind the pain. It sharpened his senses. He found himself yearning for a moment's solace so he could properly savor his triumph. But a king's burdens began immediately. Minutes later, a group of Lannister retainers was brought in, wrists bound, escorted by Euron's men. They were trembling scribes, stewards, a minor cousin of the Lannister line. Euron recognized the cousin from a banquet months ago where the man had bragged about the house's wealth. Euron gestured for the guards to line them up before the throne. "You have served the Lannisters," Euron announced, his voice echoing. "But that time is over. Now you will serve me if I deem you useful. If not, you'll find yourselves in the black cells or worse." He let that threat hang in the air. The fear in their eyes was delicious. He singled out the Lannister cousin. "You, tell me where Cersei hid any valuables or weapons. She must have had secret caches beyond the crown's treasury. Speak truthfully, or your life is forfeit." The cousin stammered, beads of sweat on his brow. I will reveal all I know, your grace. Please, spare me." Euron motioned for a guard. "Take him to Qyburn. Let them compare notes. If he lies or withholds information, break his fingers, one by one." The man let out a whimper of terror, and the guard hauled him away. One of the stewards fainted from fear. Euron laughed softly. This was the iron grip he enjoyed. Let them quake. He spent the early morning hours holding his macabre court, sorting through those who might be of use, discarding or imprisoning those who showed defiance or had no value. The chaos in the city had mostly subsided by now, replaced by grim acceptance. Sporadic fires flickered in lesser districts, but the local watch, now answering to Euron, labored to contain them. Sellswards patrolled in squads, demanding fealty from shopkeepers, tradesmen, innkeepers. Euron's black kraken banner was unfurled from the highest towers of the Red Keep. Word of his ascendancy would spread across Westeros like a cold wind. Already he could imagine the shock of distant lords, the whispers that Euron Greyjoy, once derided as a pirate and raider, now sat the Iron Throne. Some would laugh, some would quake. A few might plan to rebel. He welcomed the challenge. At last, a hush descended on the throne room as dawn's light broke through the windows, illuminating the battered marble floor. Euron rose from the throne, stepping forward on the dais. He looked out upon his men, Ironborn, assassins, Sellsword captains, a scattering of courtiers. Their eyes were fixed on him. He spread his arms. "Behold," he declared, voice rumbling, "the dawn of a new era. By dread and deceit, this city has fallen to me. Let all the 7 kingdoms know. The lion is caged, the wolves are broken, and the dragons are but cinders on the wind. I, King Euron Greyjoy, hold sway here now. Let any man who disputes that come forth and die." No one stirred. The hush in the hall was absolute, save for the crackle of the torches. Euron stood there, reveling in the moment, letting the tension coil around him. Outside, a new day began, but it was a day shaped by his dark ambition. The realm might have hoped for peace after so much war, but Euron would bind them in fear. No illusions of chivalry or justice, only the raw might of a king who took what he wanted. He turned to seat himself again on the Iron Throne, the twisted swords cold against his back. The light of dawn now fell upon him, glinting off his dark leathers, catching the malevolent gleam in his single good eye. He lifted his gaze to the high windows, where a fraction of blue sky peeked through the storm clouds. "Let the realm see," Let them whisper his name. He was no puppet, no meek steward of tradition. He was a king who had seized the greatest seat of power by guile and terror, forging alliances with those as cruel and cunning as himself. And as the morning spread over King's Landing, the city realized that Cersei Lannister had lost her throne to a worse monster. Some wept, some prayed, and some bowed, deciding that a life under Euron might be better than certain death. But all of them trembled at the knowledge that the new king in the Red Keep was a man unburdened by conscience, a man who laughed at the horrors he wrought. He touched the armrest of the throne, running his fingertips along the jagged edges of the fused swords. "Iron," he whispered, the ghost of a smile on his lips. "Iron suits me." He closed his eye, inhaling deeply. The sea breeze drifted through the broken windows, swirling the faint scent of blood around him. His men prowled at the base of the throne, ensuring no one dared approach unbidden. Outside, in the city's courtyards, the stillness was broken by the caw of distant gulls and the shuffle of uneasy crowds. It was done. He had captured the Iron Throne, outmaneuvering the cunning Cersei Lannister in a single night of dread and deceit. The promise of a new reign rose with the sun, gilded with the knowledge that he would stop at nothing to maintain his newfound power. The kingdoms might rail against him, and they might eventually gather a host to unseat him, but for now, King's Landing was his. Euron's laughter rumbled low in his throat. Let them come if they dared. He was the storm on the horizon, the reaver who had devoured the capital from within. This was only the beginning. The seat of knives beneath him would taste more blood before his reign was done, and the name of Euron Greyjoy would be etched into Westeros's history as a tyrant whose cruelty rivaled the darkest chapters of the Targaryens. It was a savage triumph, and he basked in its glory, alone in a hall full of fearful subjects. The dawn light continued to expand, illuminating the city he had conquered. He would shape it in his image, terrifying, unpredictable, forever overshadowed by the threat of a merciless king. Yes, he thought, gazing upon that vast realm of stone buildings and frightened hearts. This is mine. The Iron Throne was more than a seat. It was a symbol of absolute rule, hammered by dragonfire and sharpened by centuries of conflict. And now it was warmed by his presence, a presence that would haunt King's Landing for as long as Euron lived. He shifted, feeling a blade scrape his side, drawing a thin line of blood. A fitting throne, indeed, for a king who thrived on sharp edges. Euron smiled through the pain, letting the warmth of the blood remind him that every reward came at a cost. But in the end, it was worth every drop. For once, in all of his dark life, he was exactly where he belonged. He sat there, the unstoppable storm who had shattered Cersei's hold on the realm, a patch over one eye, a cruel grin on his lips, and the weight of 1,000 swords beneath him. The day was his and the city bowed. No illusions, no mercy, only the cold, iron truth of his reign. Euron Greyjoy emerged onto the ramparts of the Red Keep at first light, the salt wind tugging at his black cloak. Below him stretched the sprawl of King's Landing, its crooked rooftops and winding streets shrouded in the pale hush of early morning. Smoke rose in thin columns from scattered fires, remnants of the night's fighting, and the bells in distant septs tolled softly for the dead. Euron closed his single good eye for a moment, savoring the tang of the air that blew in from Blackwater Bay. He could taste the dread on the breeze. Every stone in this city had witnessed bloodshed, but last night's downfall of Queen Cersei Lannister was a new chapter. He had done what countless ambitious lords, usurpers, and conquerors had dreamed of doing: claimed the Iron Throne by cunning and fear, tearing it from one of the realm's deadliest rulers without even mustering a grand army to batter down the gates. He exhaled slowly, a current of satisfaction rippling through him. His boots thudded on the stone walkway as he paced along the high wall. Sel's-Words and a few Ironborn officers snapped to attention when they saw him, but he ignored them, letting his gaze sweep across the city. Where once the banners of the Lion had been draped from parapets, black kraken sigils now hung, flapping in the wind. The Knight's infiltration had proven shockingly simple. Cersei's hold on the capital had been weaker than she realized. or perhaps she had sensed her doom but refused to acknowledge it. In either case, Euron's men had swept through the Red Keep, overwhelming defenders from within, while the city's gates were compromised by bribes, threats, and vicious little assassinations in guard posts. By the time the city realized it was under attack, the wharves had filled with Euron's hidden supporters, gates had been opened, and the Lannister loyalists found themselves either turned, dead, or fled. Below him, in the black hours, the streets had been restless with terrified commoners. But now came that lull after calamity, when shock settles into the populace. Even from high above, Euron could sense the hush, the uncertainty. Men, women, and children peered from behind shuttered windows, or huddled in alleyways, as patrols of Sellswords roved through squares and marketplaces. He knew that soon enough, they would try to resume their lives, for the capital had grown numb after years of war and disasters. Dragons, wildfires, battles, queens and kings rising and falling in swift succession. The resilience of peasants was a strange thing, shaped as much by fear as by necessity. Euron would exploit that, let them cling to life as long as they bent the knee at the first sign of threat. A swirl of gulls soared overhead, crying out as they circled the harbor. The sea was a dull silver under the new day's light. Euron saw the shape of his flagship, the Silence, bobbing in the bay, a sentinel of his power. The rest of the Iron Fleet lay anchored in a formidable line outside the city's harbor, black sails half-furled. A silent warning to any who might think of counterattacking by water. Not that there was much chance of that. Cersei had neglected her navy. Few ships remained that would dare challenge the Ironborn at sea. And the remnants of the Golden Company, once sworn to her, were now scattered. Some had taken Euron's coin. Others had slipped away in the night, making for the Stormlands or the Crownland's back roads. It didn't matter. None would muster a threat to his hold on the throne in the near future. His new power was tenuous, yes, but every fresh conquest was precarious at the start. Euron felt no anxiety about it. Let them see how swiftly and mercilessly he would crush any pockets of rebellion. He had faced worse odds in distant seas, had endured storms that ripped sails to tatters, had prowled the smoking sea near Valyria itself. Taking and holding King's Landing was just another game, albeit on a grander scale. A footstep behind him made him turn. The scarred Ironborn officer who had served as his second for many years, Bracho, a broad-shouldered man with cropped hair and a savage grin, bowed his head in greeting. "Your Grace," he said, still wrapping his tongue around the new form of address. "We've got word from the lower city. A band of Lannister outriders tried to rally near the Dragon Pit, but our Sellswords cut them down. The rest scattered." Euron nodded. "Good. No mercy for those who hold out." Bracho gave a predatory smile. "Also, some officials from the city's Harbor Guild are below, asking to speak with you. They want permission to reopen shipping lanes, it seems. They say if trade halts, the city starves within the month." Euron let out a soft chuckle. "Let them starve or let them trade. It's all the same to me as long as they recognize who their king is. I'll speak with them briefly. But first, I must see what the wretched Lannister queen is doing in her new accommodations." Bracho's grin widened. "She's in a foul mood, or so the guards say. She's refused all offers of food. Spat on one of our men. They had to chain her to the wall in the black cells to keep her from scratching his eyes out." Euron threw his head back and laughed. He imagined Cersei's rage, a once proud lioness caged in darkness. Let her scratch all she wants. A little indignity suits her, though I'll not have my men losing eyes. Some of them still need to see straight in battle. He turned from the rampart and motioned for Bracho to walk with him. "Take me to her, then bring those Harbor Guild fools to the throne room. I've got plans for them, and get Qyburn as well. I want to see if he's a toad worth keeping." They descended a stairwell into the Red Keep's stone corridors, the torches flickering in the gloom. The deeper they went, the heavier the air felt, saturated with the ancient memory of Targaryen kings, Baratheon usurpers, Lannister regents. Euron's boots struck the steps with a decisive rhythm, a sound that reverberated off the walls. They passed a handful of Sellswords standing guard at a barred door. These men straightened to attention at Euron's approach, eyes gleaming with a mixture of fear and respect. One fiddled with a set of keys. A narrow, twisting passage descended further, the air growing damper and colder. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and the occasional squeak of rats echoed. Euron remembered that these passages had seen more than their share of cruelty. Prisoners brought low, tortured in the dark by kings and queens who prided themselves on their cunning. It pleased him to think how many illusions of greatness had been undone in such a place. And now it was Cersei's turn. At the foot of the narrow stairs lay the black cells, a region of the dungeons once reserved for the direst foes of the Iron Throne. The place reeked of mildew and rotting straw. Torches in iron brackets gave a weak glow, casting elongated shadows across the walls. Euron stopped before the cell where two guards in black cloaks stood vigil. From within came a ragged voice, muttering curses. One of the guards glanced at Euron, looking unsettled by the occupants' bitter ranting. Euron gestured for them to open the cell door. The guard fumbled with his ring of keys, then pushed the heavy iron door wide. A swirl of stale air met Euron as he stepped in. Cersei was crouched in a corner, her wrists bound to a thick iron chain that snaked around a ring set in the wall. Her short golden hair was disheveled, her face streaked with grime. When she saw Euron, her lips curled back in a snarl of hatred, but she said nothing at first. He stood there, letting the silence stretch. It was a deliberate silence, a power move. Finally, she broke it, her voice echoing in the gloom. "You've come to gloat, Greyjoy? You have your throne, you have your city. Is it not enough?" Euron took a leisurely step forward, watching how the chain rattled as she tried to edge away from him. Whether in defiance or recoil, it was hard to tell. "I've come to see how my dear queen is enjoying her new lodgings." He let his gaze roam over her soiled black gown, the fresh bruise on her cheek. "You look well enough, considering. I was worried you might waste away in despair." Cersei let out a harsh laugh. "Is that what you want? My despair?" She tugged at her chains. "Or do you simply intend to kill me when it amuses you?" Euron knelt, bracing a hand on his knee. He cocked his head, studying her pale face. "I intend to keep you alive until I decide otherwise. Perhaps you'll amuse me as a symbol of my generosity or a scapegoat for my wrath. It's all the same to me." He reached out, fingers lightly brushing the chain near her wrist. She tried to yank away, but there was nowhere to go. "Believe it or not, I bear you no personal grudge, Cersei. I simply wanted your throne. Now I have it, so I have no pressing urge to dash your skull against these stones." She spat at him, a glob of spittle flecked with blood. Euron's reflexes made him jerk back, but some of it caught the edge of his boot. He stared at it, then looked at her with a dangerous glint in his eye. One of the guards rushed forward as if to strike her, but Euron held up a hand, stopping him. "You see, it's that spirit I rather admire," he said, wiping his boot on the straw. "The defiance of a cornered beast. Let her keep it," he told the guards. "So long as she's chained, she can't do much harm. Bring her food and water enough to keep her alive, but show no leniency if she attacks you." She let out a mirthless chuckle. "You think I'll bend? You think I'll beg for mercy like your other victims? I am Cersei of House Lannister. We Lannisters do not break." Euron rose to his feet, looming above her. "All things break in time," he said. "Stone, kingdoms, kings, queens. The world devours us eventually. But I do admire your pride." He glanced at her wrists, raw where the chains had rubbed. "Take comfort in the darkness for now. Eventually, I'll decide your fate. Perhaps you'll die screaming. Perhaps you'll watch as I burn the last scrap of Lannister power from the realm. Time will tell." He turned and strode from the cell. Her curses followed him, echoing off the wet stones. Euron felt a shudder of grim pleasure. Here was a queen who had once unleashed wildfire upon her own city to destroy her rivals. Now she was reduced to hurling empty insults from her chains. The realm would see that a new terror had displaced the old. Emerging into the corridor, he found Bracho waiting with Qyburn. The old man stood hunched, lips pursed, eyes flicking toward the cell door. He looked more gaunt than ever, as if the night's events had drained him. "Your Grace," he said in a thin voice, bowing. "How fares her? How fares Cersei?" "Not well," Euron replied, his tone sarcastically compassionate. "She doesn't appreciate her new accommodations. I'm sure you can guess." Qyburn licked his lips. "Might I advise you exercise caution? She's cunning, a survivor. If you allow her freedom of movement, she'll seize opportunities. I speak from long acquaintance with her ways." "She's chained," Euron said brusquely, "and if you want to keep that gray head of yours attached to your shoulders, you'll continue offering me these helpful little warnings. Now come. We've business in the throne room with some harbor officials." They ascended the long flights of stairs until they reached the Great Hall again. Already, Euron could see the changes wrought overnight. The floor smeared free of blood, though the stains would remain for some time. The broken bodies removed, fresh torches placed in gilded sconces. The black kraken banners on the walls fluttered in the draft. A pair of battered lion sigils, painted wood and gold leaf, were piled in a corner, presumably waiting to be burned or tossed into the sea. Euron strode across the hall, savoring the echoes of his footsteps. Men parted for him, bowing or kneeling. A hush fell as he approached the Iron Throne. He mounted the steps and settled himself on the ancient seat of swords, mindful of the sharp edges. He let out a slow breath, gazing around. The entire hall was his to command. He spotted at least 24 men in fine robes or cloaks waiting near the dais, many looking uneasy. Officials of various stripes, harbor masters, city administrators, goldsmiths, moneylenders. Some were clearly merchants of means, while others had the pinched look of bureaucrats. Euron raised a gloved hand, beckoning them to approach. Bracho stepped forward, barking out, "Kneel before King Euron Greyjoy, rightful king of the Undulls and the First Men, protector of the realm." The hall rang with the words, and the men quickly dropped to their knees, more from fear than reverence. Euron gazed down upon them. "So, you wish to speak of trade, do you? Of shipping lanes, coin, and the city's markets? Very well. Let's hear it." A wizened man with patchy hair and an ornate chain of office around his neck lifted his head. He introduced himself as Molly's, a senior official of the Harbor Masters Guild. "Your Grace," he began, voice trembling. "We come on behalf of the dockworkers, the shipwrights, the caravans that bring in grain. We beg you to allow free passage in and out of the port. The city's lifeblood is trade. If we cannot bring in food and supplies, your new subjects will starve. The gold from taxes will dwindle. We must keep the port open." Euron watched him with a lazy half-smile. "Must you, indeed? I could let you starve. Perhaps fewer mouths to feed would please me, especially if that means fewer tongues to wag in rebellion. Why should I care about trade?" A ripple of terror crossed the official's face, and he cast a glance at his compatriots. "Because even a king must feed his armies, Your Grace, and an empty city yields no taxes or men. King's Landing thrives on commerce. Denying that might starve your foes, but it also starves your own rule." Euron tapped a finger on the throne's iron armrest. The points of half-melted swords prodded his back. He understood the logic. Long sieges had starved cities before, but this was no siege. He had taken the capital from within. If he wanted to hold it, he needed a certain measure of stability. A dead city offered few pleasures and fewer profits. "Very well," he said. "I'm not a fool. The port shall remain open, but all incoming ships will be inspected by my men. Any shipments of arms or suspicious cargo will be seized, and a new tax will be levied, let's say, double the old rate." Molly's eyes bulged slightly. "Double? But, Your Grace, this city is already recovering from war. Doubling the tax might hamper trade. Then your merchants will just have to squeeze their customers harder," Euron said, the edge in his voice causing the man to fall silent. "This is not a negotiation. I'm allowing you to keep the port open. In return, you'll pay me handsomely for the privilege." The official hesitated, then bowed his head. "Yes, your grace. We are grateful for your generosity." Euron gave a short laugh. "That's settled, then. Now be gone. Post notices at the docks that the king demands tribute on every shipment. My men will ensure compliance." The harbor officials bowed and scurried back, relief and dread mingling on their faces. Euron surveyed the rest, noticing that 2 or 3 wealthy merchants lingered, as if hoping for a private audience. Perhaps they thought themselves cunning enough to buy special favors from the new king. Euron glanced at Bracho and gave a subtle wave to indicate he wasn't interested in trifling bribes just yet. Bracho barked at them to clear the hall. The merchants bit back protests but complied. Fear was a simpler language than coin, sometimes. Once the officials had gone, Euron turned his attention to Qyburn, who hovered near a pillar with folded hands. "What have you learned from the Lannisters' hidden records?" Euron asked. "I trust you've had time to poke your nose in their ledgers." Qyburn nodded jerkily. "Indeed, your grace. I have uncovered some interesting details regarding their financial dealings. It appears that Queen Cersei had a secret arrangement with certain Braavosi bankers, though much was lost when the Iron Bank took measures after her default. She also kept lines of credit with local moneylenders, including House Stokeworth and House Rosby, to fund the Golden Company." Rosby. Euron rolled the name on his tongue. "Insignificant lords, if I recall, but with coin to spare." "Precisely," Qyburn murmured. "They might still hold some chests of gold or silver that were never fully delivered to Cersei. If you seized that, it could prove a boon to your treasury. As for the Golden Company, a portion of them has fled, some have already joined you, and others remain in the city under your watch. Perhaps a show of strength or a fresh contract might secure their loyalty." Euron considered it. The Golden Company was famed for their motto, "Our word is good as gold," but they had proven malleable enough once he'd slid coins into the right palms. A few more bribes, a demonstration of power, and he might hold them in check. Or he could purge them entirely to remove any lingering threat. For now, he would wait and see. "Fine. Give me a list of these leftover moneylenders. I'll have them visited by my men. If they don't hand over what's owed, we'll take it by force." Qyburn bowed. "As you command." Euron shifted on the throne, letting the silence spool out for a moment. Then he curled his hand in a gesture for Qyburn to remain. "What of the wildfire caches, old man? Did you find any mention of hidden barrels?" Qyburn's face pinched. "I have discovered some references in the Mad King's older accounts, and the haphazard notes left by Cersei's late pyromancers. The largest caches were indeed used for the September of Baelor's destruction. Some smaller stockpiles may remain in the depths of the city's undercrofts, but after so many years, many are rumored lost or decayed. The substance is volatile, your grace. If it's not stored properly, entire blocks could burn if a single cask is disturbed." Euron's laugh sent an uneasy ripple through the hall. "That is precisely why I want to find it. What better threat to hold over a rebellious populace than the knowledge that I could incinerate them at will?" He gave a dismissive wave. "Organize a search. Carefully. If you find a barrel or 2, let me know. And if the city burns in the process, well, at least they'll know I wasn't bluffing." Qyburn inclined his head. His expression revealed nothing, only that he had grown adept at serving dangerous monarchs. Cersei might have taught him well, or he had taught her. Either way, Euron found him useful for now. He motioned for Qyburn to take his leave. When the throne room was mostly empty, Euron let out a slow breath, feeling the day's weight settle. It was only morning, and already he had made decisions that would shape the city's future. A swirl of possibility drifted through his mind. Now that he was king, he had the freedom to indulge every vile inclination that had once been stifled by the constraints of lesser power. The realms might unite against him, or they might cower. He found himself itching for a new challenge, something to remind him that he was alive. Not just a man perched on a metal chair. There were rumors of strange creatures beyond the Sunset Sea, or lost artifacts in the ruins of Valyria. But for now, he had to consolidate his hold here. Let the rest wait. He rose from the Iron Throne, ignoring the little jabs of metal on his back, and strode from the dais. Several men, including Bracho, followed at a respectful distance. He turned to them. "I'm going to see the city for myself. Gather a small retinue of guards, those who won't flinch if we encounter trouble. I want to look upon the faces of my new subjects." Bracho inclined his head. "Yes, your grace. Shall I summon horses or a litter?" "Horses," Euron said. "We'll ride through the streets, and let a crier announce my presence, so they know their king walks among them." Before long, Euron was descending the steps of the Red Keep into the outer wards. The courtyard was busy with ironborn officers and sellswords sorting equipment, corralling frightened servants, and reorganizing the city watch. A line of men in tarnished city watch cloaks, those who had surrendered, stood in uneasy formation, while an ironborn quartermaster barked instructions. Euron spotted the Tyrell cousin who had helped him infiltrate the catacombs. The man lingered at the edge of the courtyard, eyes lowered as if uncertain of his new station. Euron gave him only the briefest nod. He had promised the man a measure of vengeance upon Cersei, but he did not plan to lavish any grand rewards on him beyond that. The Tyrell name was all but extinguished after all. Bracho brought forth a sturdy black horse for Euron and mounted a gray gelding himself. The chosen retinue, 10 men, a mix of ironborn, sellswords, and a pair of local knights who had bent the knee, formed around him. They trotted out of the Red Keep's gates, the clatter of hooves echoing on cobblestone. The fortress behind them was imposing even in daytime, its red walls still bearing old scars from previous sieges. Euron inhaled, tasting the city's breath, smoke, sewage, and the faint perfume of wind-borne salt. As they descended the hill, the crier, one of Euron's men with a stentorian voice, began to shout, "Make way for Euron Greyjoy! Make way for the king! Bend the knee or face the king's wrath!" Street by street they rode. Citizens darted aside, pressing themselves against walls or into alleys, eyes wary. A hush descended wherever Euron passed, as though the city held its breath. Now and then, a child cried or a merchant stared with hateful defiance, but no one dared speak openly against him. Sellswords patrolling the corners touched their brows or saluted, dragging away any who looked as if they might cause trouble. Euron saw tension in every face he passed. Some recognized him as the same vile presence who'd once boasted in King's Landing about slaying dragons at sea or capturing valuable enemies on behalf of the queen. Now he wore a crown in all but name, though no ceremony had yet coronated him formally. On a whim, he directed his retinue to turn onto a cramped side street. Shops lined it, fishmongers, cloth merchants, tanners. The stench nearly made his horse snort in discomfort. A handful of city watchmen stood guard around an intersection, but they parted quickly for Euron's procession. He dismounted in front of a fish stall, where a gaunt man and his son cowered behind barrels. Euron swept his gaze over the fish laid out on a wooden slab, some eels, a few river trout, battered from a day's dryness. The fisherman's hands shook as he attempted a bow. "Why, your grace," he stammered. Euron gestured for him to rise. "Fear not. I won't bite your head off, but let me see your catch." The man nodded frantically and showed him a salted eel. Euron sniffed it. "Decent enough," he said. "You'll sell it cheaply to my men if they come by, yes?" Yes, of course, your grace. No charge if you desire." Euron cut him off with a lazy wave. "I said cheaply, not for free. I'll keep some coin in the pockets of small folk. They might remember to keep quiet when bigger lords come sniffing for conspiracies." The fisherman managed a trembling smile. His son just stared wide-eyed. Euron turned to remount his horse, satisfied that he had delivered a message of sorts. "You can live under me so long as you obey." As they continued through the city, Euron took in the changed atmosphere. The populace had endured so many tyrants, so many illusions of hope. Daenerys Targaryen had once been hailed as a liberator, only to unleash dragonfire that reduced entire districts to ash. Cersei had ruled with an iron fist, blowing up the September in a single cataclysmic blast. Now Euron arrived on the tide of cunning and blood. The people seemed too exhausted to muster anything but silent acquiescence. The city was battered. Perhaps that served him best. Eventually, they reached Flea Bottom, the poorest district of King's Landing. It was a maze of narrow alleys, flimsy shacks, and cooking fires that reeked of cheap meat and rancid grease. Patrols here were few, for men of the watch had little interest in tangling with the hopeless. But Euron commanded a detachment to ride in anyway. He wanted to see how even the lowest rung of society responded to his reign. The crier's voice echoed among the ramshackle dwellings. "Bow to King Euron Greyjoy. Show loyalty or face the lash." A handful of sullen faces peered from makeshift doorways. Now and again, Euron heard mutterings. People had always called Flea Bottom a pit of filth. But it was also a hotbed for rebellious murmurs in times of crisis. The new king's presence here might spark defiance or quell it. He stopped in a small courtyard, where a scrawny man in tattered clothing was cooking what looked to be dog meat over a sputtering fire. The man trembled in the presence of mounted soldiers and tried to lower himself in a painful bow. Euron's nose wrinkled at the smell. If the city was hungry enough to eat dogs, they needed trade to flourish. That or the entire district would devolve into chaos. A stooped old woman shuffled forward, pressing her palms together in supplication. "Lord, King, might we have some bread or a bit of coin?" she croaked. "Flea Bottom's got nothing left but scraps." Euron stared at her, his face unreadable. A part of him found it laughable that she would beg from him, of all people. He who had carved out hearts at sea, who had hanged men from the masts of the Silence just to watch them twitch. And yet, a king might do as he pleased. He reached into his saddlebag and drew out a small pouch of coins, copper stars mostly, with a couple silver stags. He tossed it at her feet, the coins spilling across the ground. A hush fell. Eyes gleamed in the shadows. The old woman stared, disbelieving. "There," Euron said in an offhand voice. "Divide that among yourselves, or kill each other squabbling over it. I care not." She scrambled to gather the coins, tears sliding down her wrinkled cheeks. The scrawny man by the fire looked on hungrily. Euron turned his horse away. The moment he did, the courtyard erupted in a frenzy of grabbing hands, cursing, pushing. He heard the dull smack of fists on flesh. Within seconds, the old woman was shrieking as a group of desperate folk tried to wrest the coins away. One of Euron's sellswords moved as if to intervene, but Euron raised a hand, stopping him. "Let them tear each other apart if they want," he said. "They'll learn soon enough that bread can be bought from me if they keep the peace." He spurred his horse onward, leading the retinue back toward the main thoroughfares. The crier's shouts died away, replaced by the scuffle and wails in the courtyard behind them. The demonstration was enough for Euron. He had shown that he could bestow charity or cruelty as he pleased. Flea Bottom would remember that. Fear and the faint hope of coin would keep them docile, at least for a time. They left the winding alleys and climbed back toward the higher districts, past the ruins of the dragon pit looming on the hill. The massive dome was half collapsed, a reminder of Targaryen might now gone to rubble. Nearby, a squad of sellswords was posted, presumably to prevent looters or secret gatherings. Euron gazed at the sagging structure, momentarily imagining the dragons that once roared within it. A pity he hadn't been there to see them in their prime. He felt only scorn for those who rhapsodized about lost dragons. The creatures had been snuffed out by time and treachery, like so many. Perhaps that was the fate of all power. Still, he'd lived to see the day he seized a throne. That was enough for now. By the time he returned to the Red Keep, the sun was well into the sky. The stench of the capital clung to him, but he felt oddly invigorated. He had beheld the face of his new domain and found it cowed and trembling. Perfect. Let them whisper. Let them quake. A handful might scheme or dream of rebellion, but he had crushed the city from within once and would do so again. He threw the reins of his horse to a stable hand, then strode into the castle, ignoring the flurry of courtiers seeking his attention. In the queen's apartments, now his private quarters, he found that servants had hurriedly reconfigured the space for his taste. The Lannister heraldry was stripped away, replaced by black hangings embroidered with a golden kraken. Cersei's vanity table, draped in gold and red velvet, had been shoved aside to make room for a sturdy wooden chest filled with Euron's spoils from the Silence. He brushed his gloves along the edge of a table, noticing the dust. Clearly, the servants were still adjusting to new orders. A young handmaiden stood in the corner, trembling. She wore a plain dress and kept her gaze down. Euron flicked a dismissive glance at her. "Fetch me wine. Something decent. If there's none left from the old queen's stash, steal some from the cellars." She curtsied and scurried away. Euron sank onto a cushioned chair, letting out a slow exhalation. The air in the chamber was thick with the memory of Cersei's presence. Her perfumed lotions, her black lacquered furniture, the stale aura of the power she once wielded. He closed his eye, letting the hush wrap around him, though his thoughts remained restless. Soon, footsteps approached. He opened his eye to see Bracho standing at the threshold, face somber. "Your Grace," the man said. "Forgive the interruption, but we found a small group of Lannister loyalists hiding in the servants' passages below the Tower of the Hand. They've been captured. Among them is a man who calls himself Lancel Lannister, once sworn to the faith of the Seven. We thought he was dead, but apparently he survived the wildfire in the September. He's half-scarred and raving about the gods." Euron let out a short laugh. "Lancel, I vaguely recall the name. He was once rumored to be Cersei's lover, in her younger days, or so the story goes. And he played a part in King Robert's demise, if rumor is to be believed." He stroked his beard, intrigued. "So he's alive, hidden away like a rat in the walls. Bring him to me." Bracho bowed and left. Euron remained seated, tapping his foot against the floor. He recalled hearing from various informants that Lancel had been part of the Faith Militant, the fanatical armed branch of the Faith. They had challenged Cersei once and been annihilated in wildfire. If he was still alive, he might be a fanatic or a broken wretch. Either way, Euron was curious to see what use he could glean from the man. Moments later, 2 guards dragged in a tall, emaciated figure with half his face disfigured by burned scars. His hair was patchy, and he wore the tattered remnants of a simple robe, once white, now filthy. He stumbled, legs trembling, then fell to his knees before Euron's chair. Bracho stood behind him, sword at the ready. Euron leaned forward, resting an elbow on his thigh. "So, Lancel Lannister, I thought you died a miserable death in that green explosion with the rest of the Faith Militant. How is it you're still breathing?" Lancel's eyes flickered. He spoke in a ragged rasp. "I crawled away, in the catacombs beneath the September burned. Half dead. I was saved by the Mother's grace." Euron smirked. "The Mother's grace, is it? I'd say you were saved by chance. Or by some cruel design that wanted you to witness more horror. Now you lurk in the walls, a ghost." Lancel's scarred face contorted. "I prayed. I waited for the gods to deliver the city from the wicked queen. But now you sit upon the throne. Another tyrant." Euron snorted. "Yes, another tyrant. Perhaps worse than her if you believe the rumors. But you survived once. Perhaps you'd like to survive again? Because if not, I can have your head on a spike by sundown." Lancel lowered his gaze, lips trembling. "I have nothing left but my faith. My house is in ruins, my father dead, my cousin the queen overthrown. He faltered, swallowing a sob. "What do you want of me?" Euron considered the man. "You were once close to the inner workings of House Lannister and Cersei's secrets, yes? I suspect you may recall a few that Qyburn's ledgers omit. Tell me about the hidden passageways, the stashes, the deals. Anything that might amuse me." The scarred man's eyes darted frantically. There was a passage in the Red Keep that Cersei used to meet her brother Jaime in secret, and another leading to a hidden chamber under Maegor's Holdfast, where the Targaryens once kept unspeakable relics. But I do not know if the queen stored anything there. I swear it." Euron drummed his fingers on the arm of the chair. "Under Maegor's Holdfast, you say? Qyburn has not mentioned that. Perhaps it's worth investigating." He eyed Lancel, noticing the man's scrawny arms trembling under the weight of his own fear. "Fine. You live for now, if only to guide my men. If you lie, I'll gut you like a fish. If you try to slip away, I'll have your legs broken." "Understood." Lancel nodded, tears glistening in his eyes. "Why, yes, your grace." "Good," Euron said. "Bracho, take him into custody. Make him show you this hidden chamber. Then report back." Bracho nodded, hauling Lancel to his feet. The man let out a low whimper as he was dragged away, half limping. Euron watched them go with mild amusement. Another broken creature from Cersei's old circle, now forced to serve him. Such was the way of the world, shifting alliances, desperate survival. At length, the young handmaiden returned with a flagon of wine and a goblet, kneeling as she offered them. Euron took the goblet and poured. It smelled decent, likely a vintage from the arbor, though not the finest. He sipped, swirling the wine over his tongue, remembering the many nights he had bragged at Cersei's table when he pretended to be her ally. He had boasted about slaying Daenerys Targaryen's dragon, an exaggeration. He had wounded one but never delivered a killing blow, and he had stood beside Cersei in the throne room, playing the braggart suitor. All that subterfuge had been a stepping stone to this moment. He drained the goblet, leaning back in the chair, letting the tension of the day seep from his body. Eventually, he rose and strode to the balcony, pushing aside the curtains. The view from these chambers looked east, over the city rooftops toward the sunrise. The sun was well above the horizon now, bathing King's Landing in a harsh light that revealed the battered state of its walls and the plumes of smoke rising from the slums. He reflected on the realm beyond the city. Word of his conquest would spread swiftly. Lords in the Reach, the Stormlands, the Vale, and the North would learn that Cersei had fallen to Euron Greyjoy's cunning. Some might laugh in disbelief, others might panic. The Tyrells, once formidable, were nearly extinct. The Tarlys had been burned by dragonfire. The Baratheons were similarly in disarray, with no legitimate heirs left but distant branches. The Starks in the north were rumored to have retreated to Winterfell to rebuild after the wars. The Vale lords, so often isolated, might remain aloof. Dorne was a wild card. Its princes all dead or gone, houses reeling from war. Perhaps none of them had the strength to mount a serious challenge, at least not immediately. If they did, Euron would be waiting, fleets at the ready, cunning to match their old alliances. His thoughts turned again to Cersei, chained in the black cells. Would she remain a silent prisoner, or would she scheme from the shadows, rallying any pocket of loyalists? Part of him relished the idea of matching wits with her if she ever dared try. Another part considered executing her swiftly to remove that threat. But for now, he wanted her alive. A trophy of sorts, proof to the realm that even the mightiest lion could be caged. After some time, Euron returned to the Great Hall to see how the day's business proceeded. The dais around the Iron Throne had been cleaned, though faint bloodstains remained from the battle. A row of scribes sat at a makeshift table, recording edicts and hearing petitions from frightened city dwellers. Euron's men loomed behind them, ensuring no one dared voice dissent. A hush fell as Euron walked in. One scribe, a balding man with quill in hand, glanced up. "Your Grace, we have a matter requiring your judgment." Euron lazily took his seat on the throne. "Speak." A trembling merchant was escorted forward by 2 guards. He was a plump fellow with expensive but rumpled attire and a bruise swelling on his cheek. He wrung his hands nervously. "Your Grace, I beg for your mercy. Your men seized my wagons at the gate, claiming contraband. But it was only a shipment of spices and exotic silks from Volantis. I have the documents to prove it was legitimate trade." Euron leaned forward, a mock show of interest. "Spices and silks, you say? How profitable. And how much of that profit was destined for Cersei's coffers, or for my own?" The merchant stammered. There were taxes paid at the gate, as the law requires. But your men said the law has changed. They demanded triple the usual toll, then took everything when I pleaded for fairness." Bracho, standing off to the side, chuckled. Euron's mouth curved into a cold smile. Fairness. That's a quaint notion. Very well, I'll be fair. You say it's legitimate cargo, yes? Then pay double taxes, not triple, as a sign of my magnanimity. My men will keep half the spices as a penalty for your insolence in questioning them. The rest you may sell. That is my judgment." The merchant gaped, speechless. The scribe scratched furiously at his parchment, noting the decree. Euron rose from the throne, stepping down to face the man. "Pay it or lose it all. And if you complain further, you'll find your wagons burned and your head on a spike." "Yes, your grace," the merchant whispered, eyes brimming with resentment. He stumbled away, leaving the scribes to finalize the transaction. Euron relished that look of helpless anger. Perhaps the merchant would hush it down, or perhaps it would simmer into thoughts of rebellion. In either case, Euron was ready. He spent another hour hearing petty disputes, each an echo of the same fear. Men of the City Watch or the newly minted Kraken Watch had seized property, forced new taxes, demanded compliance. Some tried to persuade the king to restore older, gentler laws. Others just pleaded for mercy in small matters. Euron dispensed rulings with capricious whim, occasionally awarding a boon or cutting a fine in half if it amused him. But mostly, he allowed his men free rein to enforce his will. The message was clear. Euron Greyjoy's rule would be harsh, but not entirely without opportunities for those who learned to flatter him or bribe the right captains. When at last he grew bored, Euron dismissed the scribes and left the Great Hall. He strode across the courtyard to the royal stables, where he found a cluster of men bundling up crates of weaponry. Many of these arms had belonged to the Lannister Guard. Now they would be repurposed under new insignias. Euron spied the Tyrell cousin among them, directing a few sellswords in packing the crates. The man wore a newly tailored surcoat in black and gold, signifying alliance with the new regime. He looked up at Euron's approach, face taut with forced respect. "Your Grace," the Tyrell cousin said, bowing. "We're gathering the leftover arms for distribution to your loyal squads." Euron nodded, brushing a hand over a gilded spear in one of the crates. "Good. Keep it up. I remember you had some vendetta against Cersei for what she did to your kin. You've got that revenge now, I suppose. Feel satisfied?" The man hesitated. "Yes, your grace, in the sense that she has lost everything. But the ghosts of Highgarden remain. My family is gone, my home sacked by the Lannisters. Nothing will truly bring them back." Euron shrugged. "Such is war. Find a new purpose under my reign or rot in the past." He gave the man a dismissive gesture and moved on. Let him brood. The cousin had done his part as a guide through the catacombs. If he still yearned for vengeance, he'd find it in seeing Cersei chained. If that wasn't enough, well, Euron had no need for him. By midday, the sun blazed high and hot over the city. Euron took a meal in one of the Red Keep's lesser banquet halls, joined by Bracho, a half-dozen Ironborn captains, and a few Sellsword officers. They feasted on roast pork, coarse bread, and watered-down wine. Whatever could be hastily prepared after the chaos of the night. Euron sat at the head of the table, describing in lurid detail some of his voyages across the seas. The men listened, part awestruck, part wary, as he recounted plundering the Summer Isles, glimpsing monstrous creatures near the Basilisk Isles, battling corsairs in the Stepstones. He embellished freely, of course, and if any suspected exaggeration, they were too afraid to say so. Between these tales, they spoke of strategy. One captain inquired what Euron planned for the other regions of Westeros. "Will you march on the Riverlands next, your grace? Or the Reach?" Euron wiped his mouth on his sleeve. "For the moment, I see no reason to commit large forces. My hold here is new, so let's make this city an unassailable seat of power first. If the other lords want to challenge me, let them gather their banners and try. Meanwhile, we reinforce the walls, keep the Iron Fleet ready at sea, and send out envoys to see which houses can be bought or threatened into submission." The mention of envoys prompted Bracho to add, "Some will want to test you, especially the North. They've always disliked southern kings, and the Vale might keep to itself unless prompted." Euron shrugged. The Vale is mountainous and insular. If they don't trouble me, I won't trouble them. Yet, the north? Let them rot in their icy keeps if they please. Winterfell is too far to matter for now. My real concern is ensuring no immediate alliance forms against me. As soon as we see stirrings of one, we crush it. The men nodded, exchanging looks of agreement. Euron tossed a bone to the floor, letting a scrawny dog scramble to get it. All that can wait. For now, keep your men disciplined. I'll not have them raping and murdering in the streets at will. That only breeds rebellions. Pillage where it profits us, but don't let the city descend into chaos. A cell's word with a battered breastplate coughed. Your Grace, it might be wise to hold some sort of ceremony to show your legitimacy. A coronation, perhaps, with all the pomp. Some among the small folk might believe you're just another warlord unless they see a crown on your head with their own eyes. Euron considered it, swirling a cup of wine. A fair point. The Red Keep likely has a crown or two stashed away, a Lannister crown, maybe, or I could have one fashioned. Let them see me crowned soon. That might quell the uncertain and intimidate the rest. Bracho smirked. We could invite the High Septon from Old Town, if there is one. But I doubt the Faith will want to bless your rule, seeing as the Faith was undone by Cersei's wildfire. Euron gave a scornful laugh. I have no need of a pious fool's blessing. But if a few leftover Septons in the city want to come and mumble their prayers over me, I won't stop them. Let it be done in a fortnight, once we've solidified order. They continued their meal, discussing logistics, mustering new city watch recruits, ensuring the Iron Fleet's supply lines. Afterward, Euron departed, instructing Bracho to oversee any pressing matters. He felt the need to stretch his legs, and so he wandered alone through a section of the castle that overlooked the cliffs. There, on a lonely parapet battered by sea wind, he paused to stare out over the water. Blackwater Bay stretched away, shimmering with midday heat. Ships of the Iron Fleet were visible in the distance, their sails distinct even at this range. Gulls circled overhead, crying out as they dove for fish near the cliffs. Euron inhaled deeply, letting the brine fill his lungs. The throne behind him, the city below, he realized that, for all his cunning, his reign was fragile. He had claimed power with shocking speed, but would that power endure? The realm was fractured. Another conqueror could appear, or an uprising from within. Or perhaps some rumor of a surviving dragon would ignite new chaos. He thought of the cunning it had taken to unseat Cersei with minimal bloodshed, at least minimal by the standards of a siege. He had orchestrated hidden alliances, bribes, a hush of steel in the dark, turning city guards at just the right moment. Perhaps that was the apex of his craft. The art of betrayal used to topple a queen. Now that he reigned openly, the game changed. He would need watchers, spies, men to root out conspiracies. He would need loyalty, if not genuine devotion, then the loyalty of terror. His lips curved into a small, savage smile. That was fine. He was Euron Greyjoy, captain of the Silence, a man who had found mysteries in the darkest corners of the world. He wasn't afraid to crush a realm if it suited him. The Iron Throne was his to hold as long as it amused him, and as long as he could keep his enemies fractured. In the pit of his stomach, he felt that old stirring for something bigger, more ominous. Perhaps once he secured King's Landing, he would turn his gaze across the narrow sea, or beyond the edges of the known world, to wonders and horrors undiscovered. But for now, the game was Westeros and the board was King's Landing. His people cowered, uncertain whether to fear or hate him. Houses in the countryside watched from afar. He would rule them all or see them broken. He leaned against the cold stone of the parapet. Far below, waves crashed, sending plumes of white spray upward. The gulls continued their shrill calls, oblivious to the mortal dramas unfolding in the city. Euron's cloak snapped in the breeze, the black kraken sigil embroidered in gold near the hem. He closed his eye, recalling for a moment the old days when he had prowled the seas with no master but his own hunger. Now, ironically, he was master of thousands, responsible for upholding a twisted sort of order. Or at least an order rooted in fear. Turning from the parapet, he made his way back inside. The corridors were dim after the bright sun, the torches casting dancing shadows along the stone. He thought about returning to the throne room, but decided instead to visit the tower library. If Lancel's talk of a hidden chamber under Maegor's holdfast had any truth, Qyburn might be rummaging through records there, seeking references to Targaryen secrets. He was curious to see if anything of value had been discovered. Sure enough, in the library's echoing vault of books and scrolls, Qyburn stood at a tall desk, poring over a worm-eaten manuscript. A small cluster of quiet scribes assisted him, rummaging through piles of parchments. They flinched at Euron's approach. Qyburn bowed his head. "Your Grace, I've been reading a partial account of King Maegor's reign. Much of it is rumor and contradictory, but I have found consistent references to a sealed sublevel beneath Maegor's holdfast. Some say it was used to imprison or experiment on enemies during the Faith militant uprising centuries ago. Others claim it was a place for Targaryen rites best forgotten." Euron felt a prick of intrigue. And is there mention of anything left behind? Valyrian steel, hidden weapons, black magic? Qyburn's thin lips curved in a half-smile. Nothing explicit, but King Maegor was known for cruelty and secret construction. If he left anything, it could be dangerous. Or valuable. Euron drummed his fingers on the desk. "We'll see. Lancel claims to know a route. Send your scribes with him and a small squad of men I trust. If you find something worthwhile, let me know at once." Qyburn inclined his head. "As you command." Euron lingered for a moment, glancing at the dusty tomes lining the shelves. He had little love for reading. His knowledge came from living brutal experiences, not from the scratch of quills. Yet a faint whisper of curiosity stirred in him about the old Targaryen lore. He had once heard tales of dragon horns or cursed artifacts that could control beasts. Strange illusions, likely, but if there was any shred of truth, he wanted it in his grasp. Leaving the library, he felt a ripple of restlessness. Ruling from the Iron Throne was a triumph, yes, but it also felt like sitting in a trap of polished swords. Perhaps he would amuse himself by playing with the realm's lesser lords, summoning them to King's Landing to kneel or face annihilation. Or perhaps he would make a grand threat of wildfire to keep them in line. He let his mind wander, considering the possibilities. As dusk approached, Euron found himself returning to the black cells. He took only 2 guards, ignoring their apprehensive looks. A single torch lit the corridor where Cersei was held, the flickering flames casting long shadows on damp stone. He gestured for the guards to open her cell, then stepped inside. She was where he had left her, chained to the wall, hair matted, eyes burning with hatred. The meager food they had given her lay half-eaten. Her wrists looked raw from trying to pull free. When she saw Euron, she bared her teeth like an animal. "I should have drowned you at sea," she hissed, voice low. "I should have let the mountain break every bone in your body when I had the chance." Euron smirked, crouching out of her reach. "But you didn't, and now here we are." She glared, the torchlight reflecting in her fierce green eyes. "What do you want from me? Why keep me alive? Greyjoy, are you so starved for attention that you need to watch me suffer?" He tilted his head, considering. "In part, yes. I do enjoy seeing the mighty fall. But also, you might be useful if one of your relatives tries to rally troops in your name. Not that you have many relatives left." She let out a hollow laugh. "Jaime is dead. My children are dead. Tyrion betrayed me. My father is rotted in the ground. There's no one left to ransom me to." Euron nodded slowly, acknowledging that truth. "Still, you never know who might crawl out of the shadows. House Lannister was wealthy and feared for centuries. Someone might attempt to mount a rescue or wave the lion banner. Until I'm certain no use remains, you live." Cersei spat on the ground. "Do as you will. I'll see you in the 7 hells sooner or later." He rose, stepping backward. "Perhaps." Then he turned to the guard. "If she tries to harm herself or starve, force the food down her throat if you must. I want her alive, no matter how much she hates it." The guard saluted, expression grim. Euron left, hearing her curses echo down the corridor. Her voice rasped with hatred, and he smiled thinly. For now she could rot in chains. He had bigger tasks at hand, and she was a living testament to his triumph. Night settled over King's Landing once more. The Red Keep's torches glowed in the gloom, and the populace huddled behind barred doors, unsure what new horrors might come. From the windows of Maegor's Holdfast, Euron watched the city's lamplit streets. Occasional shouts drifted up, or the clank of an iron gate as Sel's words enforced curfew. He let the hush drape around him like a cloak, listening to a faint crash of waves beyond the walls. In the morning, he would hold another audience, continue shaping the city's governance, see who tried to curry favor. Then, in a fortnight, he'd stage a crude coronation. The realm would see him crowned in the Great September's rubble, or perhaps right here in the Red Keep, with a stolen crown perched on his head. They would whisper of the vile Greyjoy who seized the Iron Throne when all others were too weak to hold it. Let them whisper, let them tremble. He rested a hand on the cold stone of the window ledge. Far below, a watchfire flickered on the castle walls, reflected in the black moat. The hush deepened. In that moment, Euron felt a surge of dark glee. He had claimed the greatest seat of power in Westeros, not by leading a grand host to break the gates, but by sowing betrayal in the very heart of King's Landing. A lesser man might fear the tenuous nature of such a reign. Euron welcomed it. Chaos was life, and he thrived on it. Somewhere in the labyrinth of the Red Keep, Qyburn scribes would be searching old passages, Lancel leading them in hopes of survival. Somewhere else, the Tyrell cousin brooded on the demise of his house, uncertain if he had gained or lost by helping Euron. And in the black cells, Cersei Lannister cursed her fate, furious and helpless. All around them, the city sank into uneasy slumber, haunted by new nightmares. Euron watched the darkness, listening. He imagined the wind carried faint echoes of the drowned god's laughter across the waves, or perhaps it was just his own blood pounding in his ears, exulting in victory. He thought of the Iron Throne waiting in the Great Hall, a monstrous seat of fused swords. When morning came, he would sit upon it again, the pointed blades biting into his back, reminding him that kingship came with pain, a token price to pay for power. Let the realm seethe and the houses quake. He would face them all unafraid. Let them come, he whispered to the night, a crooked smile curving his lips. I'll show them what it means to fear a king who bows to no one. And so, under the moon's pale glow, King's Landing quivered in the new reign of Euron Greyjoy, Reaver, Schemer, and now the crowned terror of the Seven Kingdoms. He stood by the window a long while, letting the gloom enfold him, until at last he turned away to seek what little rest a man like him might allow himself. The future stretched before him like a black sea, uncharted and filled with hidden reefs. He would navigate it as he always had, with a savage grin and a willingness to drown all who opposed him. Such was the fate of the Iron Throne, now stained anew with blood and brine, its fearsome occupant reveling in the notion that none could unseat him without plunging the realm back into war. And if war was required, well, Euron was always eager to sharpen his steel again. The night pressed on, the city's heartbeat pounding beneath the stones, and the new king listened with relish, certain that every frightened pulse fed his ascendance. Only the waves and the gulls and the silent swords of the throne bore witness to the dawning horror of the realm's latest conqueror, Euron Greyjoy.